Hi, and welcome back to Rediscovering RC, my personal journey as I venture back into the world of RC and RC racing after an almost 20-year hiatus. I'm your host Julio, and in following up to my last episode, I mentioned that I was getting ready to build my Serpent X20 Medius touring car. And before I do, I just figured I'd get into some of the available options, in particular tuning options that are available for this chassis. Now, when it comes to chassis tuning, you have the old school thoughts of, you've got your spring settings, you've got your shock oil, you've got your shock positions, your Ackerman maybe, and then you might mess around with roll center as well. But what I quickly learned when I started looking into touring cars is that there's a lot of chassis tuning itself that's involved. So along with the kit, over the past couple of months, I've also been looking at what's available as far as tuning for the X20, and I figured I'd just go over some of the things that I've picked up, which is pretty much over the past 6 months or so, everything that's available for the car right now. So I'll go through different aspects of the chassis, and we'll go through in a little bit. Alrighty, so let me go ahead and get started with just some of the more conventional suspension tuning parts, and then we'll get into the chassis specific parts. So most touring cars, as you probably know, use roll bars in addition to shock springs to control the attitude of the car, fore and aft in terms of controlling roll. So the springs will only do so much. The anti-roll gives you a little bit more control in terms of restricting the amount of roll that a touring car has. So the X20 kit comes with 1.4 millimeter roll bars, but what you have available is you also have 1.2, 1.3, and 1.5 millimeter roll bars. So you have a lot of adjustability to be able to control the amount of roll in addition to the spring selections. So when it comes to the shocks, a lot of the Serpent cars beforehand, we're talking the S411, a lot of versions, including the RX 4.0 and the 4.1, use the same shocks that are also in the Serpent 750. Now that was kind of cool because it allowed for really part sharing between the two versions of the cars because the components were the same, namely the springs. The 4X was kind of a shift away from conventional touring car design, and now they came back to more of a conventional type suspension. In an effort to lower the CG that they gained with the 4X, they decided to create shorter shocks. So by having shorter shocks, obviously you need smaller springs to compensate for that. So the X20 does have various springs that you can get for it. The kit itself comes with 2.6 springs. So what you have as options are 2.5, 2.7, and 2.8. So in all, you've got 5 sets of springs, and you have 4 sets of roll bars to control the suspension attitude. So with that said, let me go ahead and prepare the chassis tuning parts, and we'll get into that in a second. Alrighty, so now let's get into the actual chassis tuning, and this is where things get really interesting. So let's go ahead and start with the suspension arms. A lot of chassis manufacturers these days, and particularly in the 1/8 off-road category, they've really put an emphasis on controlling the flex of the arms. They've gone to extremes of just removing a lot of the webbing material that you used to have in old arms, not only for additional strength, but to stiffen that arm. On top of that, they also have the ability to add either plastic or carbon inserts on the arms to stiffen them even more. Well, with the X20, Serpent has kind of taken that same approach, and the part number here that you can get for that is 401831, and I'll go ahead and put basically the part numbers for all the parts that you'll see here in this video, so don't worry about that. And basically, again, this is just for the front and rear arms. It's an X brace that will go across the arm and help stiffen that arm even more. So again, just another tuning option to get the actual suspension to work and take the arms out of flex out of the equation in there. Now, for the most part, I've seen people have been using both front and rear, but again, this is something you may want to experiment to see how it works for you when you try it out. And again, a lot of this advice, I have to give a shout out to the folks that are in the Facebook X20 Medius forum, as well as the folks in RC Tech, in the X20 forum group there as well. A lot of useful information in there. It might behoove you to go ahead and check that out with all the information that's available there. So that's what you can use to control the flex of the arms. Now let's move in a little bit inward and to the shock towers. Serpent also offers for the X20 carbon shock braces, and this is kind of like a Y-shaped brace. Okay, and this is part 401871, and what this does, this mounts to the lower part of the shock tower, and then has a little 90-degree aluminum piece that goes down on the chassis, and the bottom arm of this tower will go and mount on that. So what that does is it kind of stiffens that front part of the extreme front that minimizes the flex there by way of the mounting to this aluminum piece. So again, it's just a matter of controlling that longitudinal flex and again stiffening the chassis. Again, this is another part where people seem to be running it front and rear. For the most part, people are putting it in the rear. So again, experimentation, see if putting this in the front helps stiffen. I mean, in general, I would find that you probably want a little bit more bite in the front than in the back. So whether you use this, again, you can try it on track, remove it, see how it changes the flex characteristics of the chassis, and then go from there in terms of your final tuning. Okay, so let's move inside of the shock tower towards the rear, and this is where things really start to get interesting. So one of the approaches that the Serpent took is that they have basically their steering rack, the one that comes with the kit, is mounted low on the chassis. But what they've done here is that they've come out with a piece that really does two things in one. So number one, this aluminum part here elevates that steering rack, so it's going to change the Ackerman a little bit. And for the most part, I've heard people say that it has a positive effect on their steering. A few people have said that it's not so great. But the other interesting aspect of this piece is that it has 5 mounting points on the chassis below. So aside from changing the Ackerman, what this is doing is that you can, you have various screws that it comes with. You can mount these on the extremes. You have 3 screws you can mount across the center. And again, it allows you to play with managing that flex in that part of the chassis just behind the shock tower. So again, it's all a matter of controlling that flex to see how it affects the chassis overall. But it's really interesting how they're managing this flex across the chassis, and you'll see as we get towards the rear. So in addition to that, you get another 90-degree aluminum piece, and then across that void where basically the differential sits on the front of the chassis, you also have this aluminum wishbone that goes across between the aluminum piece that you mount for the base of the shock tower brace and just in front of the steering rack. So again, it's just meant to minimize that flex, because in that area you're going to have this wishbone that's going to lock in, and it's going to prevent that flex. So again, a myriad of ways to control the flex. And this is part 401872, which is the complete chassis brace set for the front of the X20. But keep in mind, I found that again, information from the forums, that if you use this brace, you also need a couple of some steering posts that do not come in the kit. So the steering posts that where the bearings mount and all that are different from what comes in the kit. And this is part 401588. So you want to make sure that you have this part here if you plan to use this one. All right, so now let's move to the rear of the chassis, and this is where things start to get crazy. So similar to the steering mount, or the rack mount here, the elevated rack mount, you have this piece here, which is really a longer piece, aluminum, which goes across the, all the holes that are in the rear of the chassis, leading all the way up to the void where the rear differential sits. And this is part 401875. It's the rear stiffener set for the X20. And this is composed of 2 pieces. You have an aluminum piece, which again has 5 mounting points similar to the front steering brace, where you can control, you can mount as many screws as you want to lock down the rear. But on top of that, you also have a carbon piece, which is a little bit longer, and this allows you to also mount to the rear of the motor mount, which sits in the center of the chassis. And again, you can control the stiffness from the bottom with just anywhere from 2 to 5 screws on the aluminum piece. And then on the top as well, you can go and mount between the motor mount and this aluminum brace to control that flex. Now this is for a longitudinal flex. So where it gets interesting in the rear is that, again, you have a wishbone piece that you can mount on the rear. And again, that you get another 90-degree piece. This will fill the void to where the differential sits in the rear, and you can control the flex there. But aside from longitudinal flex, you now have the ability, by way of this, they call it an X brace, and it's a brace that sits at the rear of the aluminum piece, which will allow you to control now the torsional flex of the rear of the chassis. So again, you get 4 standoffs, which will go just outside of the center line of the chassis. You get all the screws, so you can mount on the bottom and the top. And again, it's just a matter of, by way of how much, which screws you use. Obviously, you're going to want to use either the top or the bottom. Preferably the bottom, I would imagine, because you want that mounted to the brace. And then you can either mount them on the outside or along the center of that aluminum center brace that runs down the middle. So again, it's all about controlling the torsional flex. Now, after this part came out, Serpent then went on to come out with this complete aluminum piece. And this is basically, people are calling it a Y brace. And what's interesting about this one is that along the center line, which kind of takes place of the original aluminum piece that just runs along the center, you have basically the screws that will mount this, and this is, again, 5 pieces that mount along the center. But now you have both in the front and well, if we go front to rear, you have these two pieces in the front, you know, these two extensions in the front, and you have these extensions in the rear, which you've got 6 mounting points here and only 2 here. And this kit also comes with additional grub screws that allow you to like just tap into the chassis, because it's hard to see here, but the part where that mounts to the chassis is slightly elevated. And what this allows you to do is you could either use the grub screws to kind of like just touch the chassis, or leave them elevated to control the amount of torsional flex that the chassis is going to do. Or by way of spacers, which I've got spacers on the way, so I don't know if this is a 1 millimeter difference or a 0.5 millimeter difference, but you can just go ahead and probably from the bottom just screw into it and brace it completely, similar to the effect that this X brace does. So once I get the spacers in, I'll let you know whether it's a 1 millimeter or 0.5 millimeter difference. So this also would give you the option to just completely clamp it down on the chassis. Now you want those spacers in place because obviously you don't want to introduce tweak into the chassis. So, you know, as we all know, the tweak is really, you know, the worst thing that you can have on your chassis, because that'll really make, you know, tuning the suspension difficult. So again, this is another really interesting piece that I'm looking forward to experiment with. Again, this is something probably you might want more on carpet than anything else, but again, there's areas there, you know, low grip, medium grip, high grip, on asphalt as well, where this might come in handy. So again, it's just another critical tuning piece that you might want to have on hand, especially if you run on carpet. So aside from that, let's talk about the chassis itself. So this is the carbon version of the X20 Medius, and really for general, you know, asphalt racing, you know, when it comes to low, medium grip, and maybe even high grip, you want to prefer the the carbon over the aluminum piece. Now, I have read, by way of other manufacturers, for example, X-Ray. I came across a video recently released by X-Ray where they talk about that there are some cases where you might want to use an aluminum chassis on asphalt. And there's really 2 conditions where you might want to do that. Number 1 is the really bumpy asphalt. For whatever reason, in their testing, it would be interesting to get the the aluminum chassis for the X20. And when it comes to the aluminum chassis, there's currently 2 that are available. There's a flex chassis, which has cutouts along the sides of the chassis to allow the aluminum to flex just a little bit, although, you know, not as much as the carbon. And then there's a full chassis, which has absolutely no cutouts, and that's about as stiff as you can get. Now, normally one of those 2 aluminum chassis are the preferred way to go when you're running on carpet. But the X-Ray approach is interesting in the sense that there are 2 conditions where they might consider running the aluminum chassis, the non-flex version, compared to the carbon. And that is, again, the bumpy asphalt tracks. Because for whatever reason, at least on the T4, it does seem to absorb the bump better with the bumps better with the aluminum chassis versus the carbon chassis. The other situation where you might want to prefer the aluminum chassis over the carbon is if you're running what would be considered a high grip asphalt situation. And that's possible, especially with a lot of additives that are usually added to asphalt tracks. If you have a really smooth asphalt track that's high grip, you might want to consider that aluminum chassis as well. So that's something that I don't have yet. I don't anticipate, based on where I plan on running the car first, I don't think they're really like a super high grip situation. But if I do get to the point where I start running at different venues, I might want to consider that if there's the possibility that I'm going to run at an asphalt track with a high grip condition. Okay, so we've pretty much covered all the available chassis tuning parts for the X20. So I figured I'd close out this video with a couple of other optional parts that are available. Not so much chassis tuning, but just optional parts to affect the the overall performance of the car. So the first part up is in the front end, and this is basically a recently revised DJC front drive shaft set. Something that's kind of common in four-wheel drive cars is that obviously you have a joint on a part that's actually moving, which is the steering assembly. And in some cases, if you have a single joint there might be a tendency for that joint to kind of lock up when it's at its extremes. So when this occurs, you have what is commonly referred to as wheel hop. What happens is that basically that joint is locking up and it's just causing a temporary lock where it's going to actually jump, and that sometimes actually makes an entire suspension jump. So the simple engineering solution to that is to introduce two joints into that to be able to increase the angle at which that joint can turn. So this is the updated DJC drive shaft set. It's part 401903. If you consider this part, do keep in mind that basically the part description of this tells you that you require 401131, and the reason is that compared to the axle that comes with the kit, there's a slight difference in the this is basically the same diameter all the way across, so you need this to get into the inside part of the hub to be able to use this part. So do keep these two parts in mind if you're considering this and you have a wheel hop problem. It's not necessarily something for everybody. It depends on just how much steering you give the car in the front. But if you do find that your suspension is hopping due to the joint reaching its extremes, this is a good part to have on hand just in case. The other part is really in the belts. I've seen a couple of manufacturers that have belt-driven cars come out with something like this, and this is basically a low-friction X20 belt. And really what differentiates this from the standard one is that these are white, and it's supposed to offer basically lower friction. Now, as you probably know, belt-driven cars have kind of been notorious for being less efficient than some of the shaft-driven cars that we've seen in the past. However, with these, the belts in general have gotten a lot better, and this is even a lower friction option. So I will probably build the car, with the belts that come with the kit, but at some point I'll probably want to experiment with this to see if I can see a notable difference between the two. Alrighty, so that concludes my overview of all the available optional parts that you have for the Serpent X20 Medius. Please do me a favor, like, favorite, comment, and subscribe. Any and all feedback you give me will do a world of good towards delivering the kind of content that you guys want to see. Also, if you haven't noticed below, I'm on Instagram, so please take a moment to check that out. I'll be building this kit and taking pictures along the way. As much as I would love to, unfortunately, my equipment won't really allow me to, video the entire thing. So what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and start building this kit. If there's anything interesting, which will be part of my build notes, which I will have a build notes episode coming up following this, I'll be sure to capture that and just show you different little things that I may come up along the way. So overall, I'm looking forward to building this kit. It's going to be fun. So I hope you look forward to that as well. So until next time, I'm your host Julio. Take care.